Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Curious About the Human Body, an online and virtual festival here at Glasgow Science Centre. My name is Gillian, and today we will be joined by Professor Judith Pratt for their session, Who Needs a Brain? And Judith is a research professor at the University of Strathclyde. If you are joining us live, please send your questions through our YouTube channel and we'll get through as many as we can. And thank you so much and welcome to the schools who have already submitted some questions and are joining us today. So without much further ado, it's my pleasure to say good afternoon to Professor Pratt, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Gillian, and welcome everyone. I'm here today to open your minds to the amazing world of your own brain. So first of all, can everyone across all the schools point to where they think their brains reside in their body? Have the next slide, please. Yes, I'm sure you're all right in thinking your brain lies inside your skull. And your skull is very hard bone, so it's there to protect your brain because your brain does such important work. So let's move on to the next slide. And this is a photo of a brain, and this is a real human brain. And what do you think it looks like? It looks very kind of almost squishy like a sponge, and it actually feels a bit like a cross between jelly and butter. And there are lots of ridges and grooves on it, which means that we can pack a lot of cells in the brain because it increases the surface area so much. So in the next slide, we're just going to see a little bit more about where the brain is and what it looks like inside the skull. And you probably heard that there are two cerebral hemispheres in our brains, which are shown here, and they're connected together by white matter. And there are lots of different brain regions inside which allow us to do many different activities, which we're going to talk about shortly. So the brain is packed full of brain cells. Can I have the next slide, please? And this photo, which was taken by one of my students from a microscopic image of brain cells. So taken under the microscope, which means that these brain cells are tiny. They're smaller than a grain of dust, basically. And you can't see them with the human eye. You have to look at them under the microscope. And I think you'll agree that this brain cell here in this sort of luminescent green color is very beautiful. And it might inspire some of you to do some artwork based on this and think about how similar it is to some things in nature or in your garden maybe and your surroundings. So brain cells are tiny, and the cell body is this oval shaped structure in the middle of the picture. And that contains the genetic material of the cell. And it's typically about 100th of a millimeter in size. So that's tiny, as I've already said. And these brain cells, what are they called? They're called neurons. So that's something we have to remember, that brain cells are called neurons. And we have a vast number in our brains, about the same number as there are stars in the galaxy. We have about 100 billion brain cells. Now, can we have the next slide, please? So, yeah, we've just learned brain cells are called neurons, and they talk to each other by sending messages. And these messages can be electrical and chemical. Both electrical and chemical messengers are very important in the way brain cells talk to each other in the brain. And the next slide This shows all our brain cells working together, the neurons, in other words, and showing the electrical activity that passes between the brain cells along these spindly shaped axons that we saw in the image. And they work together, not just randomly, but they work together in organized networks to allow us to do different things, whether that be talking, as I'm doing now, running, playing a game, or learning something at school. So the networks work together to allow us to do different things. So let's just talk a little bit more about that. And this slide really summarizes all the different things that our brains do. The little girl on the top left picture, she is smelling a flower. And so she's using her senses, so her sense of smell, but also her visual senses, because she'll see what color the flower is. And these sensory senses, such as smell and sight, are taken, the information from our eyes and ears is taken into our brains, where we process that and allow us to see and smell things and also hear things as well. So on the right-hand side, we'll see somebody riding a bike. And because our brains are very important in enabling us to learn to do movement and also skills like learning a bike, learning to play football, all these kinds of activities are dependent on our brains working properly. And we have parts of our brain that ultimately, once we've learned how to do things, allow us to do them just like a habit without really thinking about doing them. We just get on our bikes and ride away. As well as movement, of course, our brains are very important in allowing us to have fun and social interaction with our friends and family. And so this left-hand picture shows lots of people playing together and generally having good fun. And that's also dependent on parts of our brain. And the middle picture at the bottom, which I'm sure is what you all do at school, you pay attention to your teachers and you learn lots of facts. And you find it very enjoyable too, just like these children are in this image. And on the bottom right, we have a picture of a young lad who's fallen over, probably from playing football, and he's experiencing pain. And pain is something else that our brains allow us to perceive. So when we fall over and hurt ourselves or cut ourselves, messages are sent to our brain, and our brain tells us how painful that is. So ultimately, our brains are amazing in that they allow us to do so many things. And we all, of course, need a brain because of that. What I want to do now is just show you on the next slide a few very important parts of our brains. So I've just selected 4 different brain areas. The first brain region I want to talk about is the prefrontal cortex in red. And that's at the front of our brain, just behind our forehead. And this part of the brain is very important in letting you make plans and decisions. You pay attention and learn. Working memory, very important. You can also manage your feelings. It's a bit like a command center of your brain. And this part of the brain, interestingly, only fully develops until when you become an adult. So it's the last part of your brain to fully develop. Then in the green, we have the thalamus, and this structure lies within the middle of the brain, and it's a bit like a sorting hat. It's a filter of information. We have loads of information going into our brain. If you think about walking to school, all the things you see, hear, you might have to get on a bus or a train, all this information is going into your brain to be processed. And your brain has to decide what's the most important action you have to do to allow you to do the task in question, which would be getting onto school on time. So the thalamus acts like a filter, a sorting hat. The next structure is the hippocampus in blue. And this lies between our ears and across the brain. And this region of the brain is incredibly important for storing memories and finding memories. And it also sends messages to other parts of our brain, like our cortex, where lots of memories are stored for long periods of time. And finally, on this slide, we have the amygdala. Now, this part of the brain is a very reactive part of the brain. It allows us to experience emotions. So we might be happy, we might be sad, we might be angry. And this part of the brain is, if you like, very reactive. It doesn't really think much. And it's also very important for storing our emotional memories. So I hope I've given you a little bit of insight into some important parts of our brains. But I'm now going to move on to something that I think has been quite amazing in the past few years, and that's the advances in brain technologies that have allowed us to measure activity of people's brains to understand exactly what's going on inside our brains. And the type of technologies we're talking about are going into a brain scanner where you might have a CT scan or an MRI scan. Some of you may have had friends or relatives that have, or even yourself, been in a scanner where your brain has been scanned. And on the top right-hand side, we can see lots of images of sections throughout the brain that are taken from one of these scans, such as a CT scan. And there we can work out what might be damaged after somebody's had a stroke, for example. On the bottom left, we can see measuring the activity of our brains, such as with an EEG. And here we can measure things like which parts of the brain are affected, for example, in epilepsy. And then in the bottom beautiful images, these are MRI scans, magnetic resonance image scans. And these have really advanced in the last decade, where we can understand so much more about all our connections in our brain and how they change when we're doing different activities or in various mental health conditions or in disorders such as dementia. So fantastic technology we have now to understand what's going on inside our brains. So if we move to the next slide, I just want to highlight that often our brains don't work perfectly, and we might experience a brain condition. Some of these mean that we might not be able to move properly. You might have relatives who've suffered from Parkinson's disease, where they suffer from tremors and difficulty walking. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Sometimes we don't remember things so well, such as in dementia. In stroke, sometimes we can't lose our ability to talk, for example. And in some mental health conditions, we have difficulties controlling our emotions and behavior. So how can science help to help people with brain conditions? Well, of course, we do have some medicine. We have medicines that can help people, but we also have so advanced in technologies, we can now actually use technologies to some degree to control our brains. And in the next slide, we'll see how a technology called deep brain stimulation is being used to help people with Parkinson's disease. So, as I said, this is a condition where people experience difficulties with walking and experience a lot of tremor in their hands, which makes it very hard for them to do daily activities such as writing or eating and drinking. And so some people are now being treated with deep brain stimulation, whereby they have an electrode placed in the part of the brain that is affected in this disorder. And that's identified using those brain imaging techniques that I talked about just recently, like the MRI and so on. So we can precisely locate the brain area affected. We can then place an electrode in that area and connect it to a pacemaker, which was placed under the skin of the chest and left there to reside permanently. And when the pacemaker is turned on, it sends electrical impulses to the brain and the person's symptoms improve. And so it's quite miraculous how this treatment can improve people that experience Parkinson's disease. And your teachers will have some resource videos to show you, to show how amazing that is. And that leads me on to my final slide, which is the challenge we're wanting you to do. And we want to use you to use your brains to suggest and design a device for a brain condition. And there's more details on the Glasgow Science Centre website with resources available for you and your teachers to look at. And I'm really looking forward to seeing some really creative ideas for improving a brain condition that you've selected, where you want to improve the quality of life of people experiencing that condition. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all that information with us. I would say it's mind-blowing, but I don't want to say pardon the pun. And I have to say what really struck me was when you mentioned jelly and butter. Those are my two favourite foods. I might have to think about that differently. Oh, I think we might be having a wee sound issue there. I'm not sure if we have your audio.
Can you hear me?
Oh, I can hear you now. Yes, absolutely. Great. But I think what struck me certainly from these sessions is there's so much going on within us that we don't even have to think about. And I think what's really great is hearing about research and work that scientists are doing and helping us to continue to stay healthy and to face challenges. So thank you so much. Your presentation will be online as with yesterday. So please, anyone who's watching, please feel free to go over any information there. But we do have some folks with us live online and they have submitted some questions. So we're going to get them sent through. So good afternoon to Damarnock Primary 6-7. So as you said, our brain is a little bit like, feels like jelly or butter, but they're asking how heavy the brain is.
Yes, interesting question. Well, the human brain weighs about 1.5 kilograms, so I guess that's about 3 pounds if you're in that kind of weight.
I suppose that's roughly maybe like a bag of sugar or bag of flour, potentially. So have a look out for that the next time you're in the shops, if you're able to pick up that level of weight and see how that feels. And again, as I said, it's all encased up in our heads, so we don't even have to think about it, which is great. So thank you for that, Damarnock Primary. I think we have another question. You did touch on this and you highlighted some areas already, but how many sections make up your brain?
Yeah, that is a bit of a how long is a piece of string question, because it depends on when we, in my lab, for example, we would maybe slice up a brain using a thing called a cryostat, and we would maybe cut through 100 sections. But of course, it depends on where you want to cut the brain. If you want to cut the whole brain, it also depends on how thick you cut your sections. Some you might want to cut 1 millimeter thick. Some might you want to cut just a few microns thick. So it can range from like 50 to 5,000, basically, depending on how thick you cut the sections.
And obviously, maybe depending on the work that you're doing with the brain, what you're looking for.
So on, So.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. We have another question coming through. So I wonder if this is more in relation to the areas you were talking about that control different parts. So which is the biggest section in terms of size?
Yes, that's another question. I would say, generally speaking, or can I rewind a bit? Because people think, oh, and this might be another question as well, actually, how many brain regions or areas or sections are there in the brain? If you go on Wikipedia, it says 3, which to me as a neuroscientist is a very simplistic description of how many brain regions we have. I would say we have well over 100. And they all subserve different functions. But if you want to go into a general answer to that question, which is the biggest section, I would say our cerebral cortex is our biggest section, because the cerebral cortex is the outer surface of our brain hemispheres. It's just a few millimeters thick, but it's got, I think I showed, on that picture where it looks a bit like jelly and butter, it's got lots of ridges and grooves. And if you were able to kind of flatten it all out, it would be huge. And in fact, it has about 20 billion neurons in it, 20 billion brain cells. So that's about a fifth of all your cells in your brain. So,
and that's just on that outer area.
Yeah. But because it's all kind of ridges and grooves, it's all kind of packed in closely together. Yeah,
that's great, fantastic. As I said, it's amazing what's in there, what's going on. And we just have to keep it as healthy as we can. So that's great. Thank you so much. I think we have another question coming through again. We've got Kilmarnock Primary P67 with us. Do humans have different sizes of brains, and does the size affect a person's intelligence?
Yeah, well, of course, there's that question, what do we mean by intelligence? I'm not going to address that question. So generally speaking, most people's brains are very similar in size. But what goes on inside our brains affects basically like who we are and what we're good at. And everyone's unique. We all have our strengths. Some of us are going to be amazing mathematicians. Some of us are going to be really, really creative. And other people are going to be really great at sport. And it all depends on how your brain networks develop through childhood, through to adulthood, as to what you become good at or what you're motivated to work to achieve and what you're most interested in. So we're all unique, we're all very special, and I would say our brains develop based on nature and nurture, our genetic makeup as well as our experience in life to make us who we are, to be great at doing something and be fulfilled in our lives. And I think that's what everyone should aim to do, really, to get fulfillment of their life. And I don't think we should perhaps measure things in terms of intelligence in that way. I think you're smart if you're a mathematician. I think you're smart if you are a creative artist or writer. I think you're smart if you're a fantastic footballer. That's my view.
No, and that's great. As you said, who decides what is intelligence? And here at Glasgow Science Centre, we celebrate everyone and everybody's skills. So that, I think that's a great answer. We are all unique, and that's what makes everyone brilliant. So thank you so much for that. We have another question coming through from Christopher. So you have touched on some maybe challenges that people can be faced with the brain, but how can technology help dementia?
Amazing question. Dementia has been, I guess, the challenge of the last 50 years. We have got medications, I guess, that target those areas of the brain that are kind of being affected dementia, which help them work a bit better, but they don't work better forever. We've got developments in what we call antibody therapy now, where we can try and neutralize, if you like, those deposits of amyloid protein, which are causing the brain cells to die. So we have got some technologies, but I think there are lots of challenges ahead to get something that will actually stop the progression of dementia. And one of the other challenges is identifying when these changes start to occur in our brain, because quite often these changes might occur well before we have any symptoms. Mm-hmm. And that is something technology will have to try and address, I think. There's a big study ongoing in this country called Biobank, and that is monitoring, I think, a few million people in the way they, from basically childhood early adulthood right through late life, on how people develop, what diseases people develop, and what develops with what, and what risk factors are involved in getting them to get dementia, for example, whether it be dietary factors or toxins in the diet or toxins in the environment, or I'm not saying they are involved, but is looking at all these factors. And I think those kind of studies on vast numbers of people will help us identify how we get to try and identify those at risk of getting dementia, and maybe helping them earlier rather than when it's a little bit beyond helping them recover completely.
Because certainly the small understanding I have of it, as you said, by the time you're showing symptoms or you're so far down the path, it is about supporting what's already going on. Mm. So perhaps technology can, as you said,
help prevent.
Yes, which sounds amazing, and we're so thankful to have people out there who are working hard to figure these things out. So that's a great question to ask as well. So thank you for sending that on in. We have another question coming through. For yourself, have you ever made a surprising discovery about the brain?
Yes, that's an interesting question. Is a discovery ever surprising? I guess it is. I guess one of the things we've discovered, which I found quite amazing, was that there's a tiny part of the brain that seemed to be affected when we were studying brains at risk of having schizophrenia. And this part of the brain, I will tell you the name, you probably won't remember it. It's the thalamic reticular nucleus. And this is a tiny part of the brain. And it turns out it controls all the other parts of the thalamus in our brains. So it really has quite an amazing function. And it turns out this is affected in schizophrenia, which is a mental health condition. So that was a discovery that we found. And it's basically a region we now call the searchlight, if you like, of the brain.
That is fantastic. And I think as well, something that always strikes me is how much our brains are in command and control everything, but how much they can work against us sometimes as well. And it's all these little parts of it that come together. So that's a great discovery to share.
And they basically, our brains work in networks, networks to do movement, networks to do social activities, and networks to sleep.
So everything, all being well, will work together. And as I said, there's folks out there who are supporting everyone with that. That's great. We do have time for 2 more questions. Okay. So the next one, again, from Delmarnock Primary 6-7. What is your favourite brain exercise?
I guess I like doing yoga because that puts my brain in a brain state that I find very kind of relaxing and mindful. And it also, I find, later on in the day, it will prepare me for my work to be more focused and not get so stressed about it. So I think those kind of activities, whatever works for you, and yoga works for me, are great things to do, because your brain can, become much healthier, if you like, by doing these kind of activities.
Excellent. And I think something we speak a lot about is being, we're so bombarded with technology and media, and actually doing something, as you said, to become present and mindful supports the focus. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
great. A good one to try, I think, if you can. And time for our final question. So if anybody at all watching today or logging on a bit later wants to work in your field, what would you recommend they study or get experience in?
Yes, well, to become a neuroscientist or a brain scientist, if that's what you really focused on doing, you would have to do a degree. And you can do a degree in neuroscience, or you could do a general science degree with some speciality in neuroscience, or maybe psychology a bit as well, depending what you find most interesting. But if you want to kind of go on to do research, you'd have to do a degree. And then after your degree, you would do a specialist 3-year project, a PhD, Doctor of Philosophy. And that would be with someone like myself, for example, who would do research in a particular topic of interest. So that could be, the neuroscience of dementia, or developing new treatments for Parkinson's disease, or for mental health conditions like depression, or the genetics of some of these brain disorders. Or you could go into bioengineering if that you were interested in that side of things, because those deep brain stimulation devices require bioengineers to devise the devices, basically. So neuroscience is a vast discipline, and it can be from like psychology, behavior, molecular genetics, right through to engineering and maths, of course. We have mathematicians analyzing our brain networks as well. So lots of opportunities to work in this field, which I think is really rewarding and fascinating.
No, absolutely. And I mean, we could talk all afternoon about it, but unfortunately we have run out of time. And I think a good start is to have a look at the resources that we have on our website, including the activity, the follow-up activity, which is part of the Curious About the Human Body. So anybody watching either live or a bit later, please check that out. It's on the Curious About the Human Body page. So again, thank you so much for joining us again today, Professor Pratt, and thank you so much for everybody at home. There's some information along the bottom if you do have a chance to fill out a survey about our festival. It would be greatly appreciated. But again, just to say thank you again for joining us, both online here and at home. We hope you've had a great afternoon. Please check out the website. There's another day of sessions tomorrow, and we have some other things this afternoon as well. You can access anything at all at your leisure. But thank you for joining us at Glasgow Science Centre and for Curious About the Human Body.